going to be discussing the evolving landscape of work. What are the key trends shaping our work environments? What's intentional collaboration and how do we actually do this? How do we use meeting time better and leverage AI-enabled tech? Bringing her wisdom to this conversation is my guest, Gwen Stirling-Wilkie, who's a future of work expert, business leader, award-winning author and educator. She's worked with global businesses in many industries for 30 years. Her latest book, OmniWorking, Work Effectively in All Ways from All Places, was released on Amazon in October last year and guides leaders through the complexities of flexible and distributed work models. Welcome to the business of being brilliant, Gwen.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too, because I know we share some very common interests in the world of work and similar kind of backgrounds and skill sets. I'm really looking forward to digging into what's going on in the world of work at the moment and how leaders can, I guess, cultivate more effective working practices. So let's dive straight in and see, what's really happening today. A lot of people say, we've nailed hybrid, etc. And now we're 2 years on from the pandemic. But I think that's a little bit optimistic. And I think we're still in a state of flux and we're still trying to figure stuff out. So, 2 years on from the pandemic, what's your take on what's happening? 2 or 3 things that you're seeing in the world of work at the moment?
I think, firstly, I don't think we've got this thing called hybrid nailed. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is I think hybrid only solves one problem we're facing. And I'm hoping that as we go through our conversation, then I'll kind of explain a little bit more about what I mean about that. But I think in response to your question, I think there's a kind of a bigger mega trend that's going on, which is affecting the here and now as well as our reactions and responses as we've emerged from the pandemic over the last couple of years. So for me, the mega trend is about shifting expectations about work and where work fits within our broader life. And if you look at some of the work that Linda Grattan has done, and particularly the work around a multi-stage life, that there are different expectations. We no longer train in a particular area of expertise, stay in that expertise the right way through our career, and then retire. Life is very, very different now with different life expectations and multiple generations in the workforce at the same time. So that is also driving a whole behaviour and expectation set of people across every single generation, which is creating its own set of challenges for organisations. Organisational boundaries, I think, as a result of that, are really becoming much more blurred and much more porous about what is the actual relationship between people who add value to the business and their contractual arrangements within your organisation. So the emergence of the gig economy, portfolio life, different career stages, how people manage the transition away from full-time employment, part-time employment, portfolio careers. So there's all these kinds of things that are happening at the same time as organizations are really making a whole series of adjustments to what the huge seismic impact of the pandemic. So you've got all of those things happening. And when it comes down to what's actually going on at the moment, I think for me, there's probably 3 or 4 trends which I think are really important to pay attention to. The first one is about the location of where work is happening around flexibility. And you look at some of the latest reports that are coming out now around, 62% of organizations are offering some form of flexibility for people around their location, around where they're working. And then, the rest of 38% are saying, no, we need to have people in the office full time. Now, I draw these figures from a fabulous resource produced by Scoop over in the States called the Flex Index. They have coming up for 8,000 organizations around the world who now contribute to that. So this is where this data source is coming from. And interestingly, flexibility, organizations offering flexibility are on the increase, and organizations that are wanting people in the office full time is in a decline. Now, if you look further into that flexibility data, it says that 33% of those 62 offer full flexibility. That is, you choose where you work based on the kind of work you're doing. There may be some organising framework around it, which in the book I call guiding principles or freedom in a framework, but you have choice and you have autonomy. Then the others are operating under what is called structured hybrid. That is some form of mandating about how many days a week you go into the office, or mandating which specific days you go in. So that's the sort of the data that exists around where the trend is going about location of working. I think along with that, what we're also starting to see is a performance gap opening up. So organisations that are offering some form of flexibility, and again, the Flex Index is starting to produce this data as well, along with other organisations like Boston Consulting Group, and Nick Bloom, who is another longitudinal researcher, and Brian Elliott, who I know is a former guest on your podcast.
Yeah.
There's a great group of people who are really helping surface some important data and trends for organisational leaders to be better informed about the decisions that they're making. So this performance gap is starting to open up, that we're starting to see now. Employee engagement scores are taking a hit, particularly in those organisations that don't offer a form of flexibility for people. And then you've got managers who are feeling just overwhelmed and underprepared. And I think all of these then are starting to impact, they impact trust, they impact a sense of freedom and autonomy. Micromanagement tends to come in because people aren't prepared and equipped with the skills to be able to mobilize their teams from afar and focus on performance outcomes rather than presenteeism and productivity.
Yeah, that's a great summary of what you're seeing happening. Thank you. And, to your mega trend that you started with around shifting expectations, I think to add to that or complementing that is, the fact that I don't think organisations can get away with having a one-size model of work now for their workforce, to your point, because they're multi-generational workforces, because there's very different sets of needs in terms of support and flexibility. So I think, a lot of today's world of work slightly gets reduced, in my view, to talking about these return to office mandates and the location of work. But it is just one bit of the jigsaw. And if you're focusing on what we're mandating people to do, you're really missing the bigger and more important conversation, which is, as you say, what are the performance outcomes we're trying to achieve, and how can we enable teams and individuals to deliver that, right?
Yes. And all of my work has been about, don't get distracted by where. And I think anything you read in the media is all about the narrative, the polarized narrative about people working from home equals not doing anything. People being in the office equals, oh, this is where everybody needs to be. And I think it's about how people work, of which location is only one. It's an important element. People still need to come together, but it's when you come together, why you're coming together. Do it intentionally and also give people autonomy and choice. Because as human beings, we're hardwired to want to have that sense of autonomy. We want autonomy, we want purpose, and we want I can't remember the third one. Daniel Pink, help me out here. There's a third one which is completely escaped my mind.
Is it like being connected? Sorry, mastery.
Yes. I knew I'd remember it in the end. And that's a fundamental human need. So I'm always a little bit confused as to why we're trying to take away something which is so important as an indicator of how much people are willing to engage with your organization and what it is you're wanting them to do. People are brilliant. We hire them because they're brilliant. And then something happens where we put them in a situation where they can't bring the brilliance that we hired them for.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And that's what this podcast is all about. How do we create organizations that really enable their, brilliant talent to succeed and to thrive? And I think another kind of bigger trend, societal trend to mention, is the rise in loneliness and how that's affecting people. And yes, lots of people want that flexibility around where they work and when they work. But there's also this challenge about how we help people feel like they belong and they've got support and they're making meaningful friendships or having at least, enjoyable interactions with work colleagues. That does genuinely become quite hard to do with a very distributed workforce. So what would be your advice, or how do you advise business leaders who are saying, okay, I accept that we need to offer a lot more autonomy and flexibility, but on the downside of that, it's really hard to keep people feeling like they are connected at the human level and they don't just come together to talk about tasks. So how do we help people feel like they belong and they gel and they've got those rewarding conversations that make us feel like, yeah, I really like where I work?
I think there's the two aspects of it. I think there's the day-to-day interactions that we have, which might be at a team level. It might be at the people who I work with and connect with most often in as I get my job done, which isn't necessarily members of your team, because often we work across teams, but we know the kind of the handful of people who we're in contact with daily or weekly, frequently. So there's something about how do we foster some of those connections. And I think we can take a certain amount of self-responsibility in our conversations to spend time connecting with each other as a human being first, before we dive into the task.
Yeah.
And I think there's something strange that happens when we log on to a Zoom call or a Teams call, which creates this need for speed and urgency, that I have to get through this really, really quickly, and that we can only focus on the task that we're here to do. But actually, we can connect on a human level. So I think there's definitely something we can each do individually. There's also something that at a team, at a leadership and a management level, that we can do about making sure that our team has that bonding time, and for some people it will look very differently for others. Some people love to do that kind of, I don't know, online kind of social fun gathering. For other people, that's their idea of something that's absolutely awful and they would never want to do it. So what is appropriate for different kinds of people? So for some people, it might be about connecting around a hobby, as they would have done in the office anyway. So it's creating opportunities for people to do that, and also being thoughtful about it. But certainly a rhythm and a routine that I encourage every leader is to do connection before content. And it was for me, one of the big things that was important during the pandemic. And we know from the data around our social capital that bonding social capital, which is that sense of cohesion within our team, soared during the pandemic because we paid a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic, it's kind of started to dip off again because it hasn't been kept up there in terms of a level of importance.
Yeah.
And I think at an organizational level, or maybe a department, a country, depending on how your business or enterprise is structured, there is something which is called intentional togetherness, which Atlassian have done a fantastic job of showcasing to everybody about how important it is and tracking the impact of it. So they've done a lot of experiments which say we can see from our data that if our people come together physically once a quarter, that creates a boost in connection. people feeling connected to their colleagues, which we know then has a knock-on effect with their ability to collaborate. We know that has a knock-on effect in terms of their effectiveness and producing the outcomes and delivering their work. We can see it starts to dip off after 3 months. By 4 months, it's really on a nosedive. So we know we need to reboost it. And so they've structured their organisational gatherings to pay attention to that.
Yeah, it's really smart. And I love the way that they're experimenting but also tracking the data and looking at the impact. And they about a year ago, they adopted a fully distributed model, didn't they? So
they did that
everyone
right at the beginning of the pandemic. They never went back. So, and they've just recently published a report at the beginning of the year sharing their results from their first 1,000 days of being a fully distributed organisation. So that's a great resource for anybody who's kind of interested in this kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, what you're saying really chimes with what I talk about with teams and other guests on the podcast, like Professor Robin Dunbar, who is author of The Social Brain. He's a professor of evolutionary psychology at the University of Oxford, and he came on and talked about his book, The Social Brain, but essentially saying exactly what you're saying. We are wired to be social creatures, and he said, if you're a CEO, the best thing, the most valuable thing you can do is engineer these opportunities for people to spend time socially together, not task time, but social time. And he says the same. If you're, imagine if you've got a big negotiation to do with a client, most people think, okay, well, we'll have, the difficult negotiation conversation and then we'll go out for dinner. He says that's completely the wrong way around. Do the meal first, then go into the negotiation. And I think, it took, from my own experience and learning over my career, I think I've learned when you're paying attention to the relationship and investing time in that, the work transactional stuff just happens that much more easily, right? Because you've got that underlying basis of trust and connection, etc. So it makes for much more resilient teams and organisations.
Yes. And it was important before the pandemic. It's just become even more important afterwards.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I found when I was doing the research for my book was that so much of the things that I write about and talk about and recommend to leaders aren't brand new. They are things that existed before. We've just forgotten about them. And what's happened is they've become more important.
Yes. Yeah, because they're needed to counterbalance our very digitally enabled, very time-pressured experience of work. So let's dig a little bit more into this intentional collaboration, because I know in the book you share a really good model around bridging versus bonding. So if somebody's listening and thinking, okay, we're definitely in need of nurturing a bit more collaboration and bringing people together in better ways, how could they practically do that?
So Michael Arena, who is somebody who I started following and listening to his work and reading his articles, which he was producing right the way through the pandemic, really started to study this phenomenon. I mean, social capital, organizational network analysis has, again, been around since before the pandemic, but I think it's really come into its own as a way of, again, evidencing with data what's been happening relationally. And so what he talks about is within social capital, you've got bonding social capital and you've got bridging social capital. So bonding is where we're focused on our own team. Now, due to the pandemic, as I said, that was about team cohesion, making sure that everybody felt connected. But bonding social capital is also really important when teams are delivering their outcomes, delivering their objectives, and really it's operationalizing delivery, strategic execution activities which come under bonding social capital. And then the other kind of social capital is this bridging social capital, where we may need to reach, of course we do in everyday life in organizations, to those who aren't within our immediate team. We might need to connect with multiple teams or people across multiple different functions. So if I'm out there as part of an implementation team on a client site, I still need to be able to talk to the operational people, to the technical people, to the marketing people, to the supply chain people. So those are bridging connections.
Mm.
Now, not only across different teams and functions in our organisation, but also outside our organisation into other areas and other domains, because that's where our innovation comes from. So in
Yes.
order to work generatively, to innovate in terms of our products and services, we need to have good bridging social capital. And so working very intentionally, again, first of all, you need to know where those real connectors are in your organization. And when you look at the network analysis work that is done, often they are the people who we least imagine who are the most connected. And they help from a number of different reasons. One, in terms of sources of innovation and creativity, to join dots up from outside the organization, trends they're spotting in customers, bits of data and information that other people may not pick up on. So they're fabulous for doing that. They're also great for introducing new ways of working, organizational transformation and change. They're often your real change makers. They're the influencers, the social connectors who can mobilize and engage large parts of the organizational network, which don't follow the structure of the organization reporting chart.
Yeah.
There's this social network that exists within an organization. We know the people of how to get things done. Oh, I'll just go and talk to, and oh, such and such will just give me some information so I can smooth that through or make that happen. So social capital, both bridging and bonding, is such an important way of being much more intentional right through your product development life cycle. From the very, very beginning, you need to do some bridging and then you need to do some bonding. So you're looking outside and then you're coming inside. You need to then socialize and test out and experiment with prototypes. You're doing that in a bridging way. And then when you come to strategic execution, to operationalizing it, then it's kind of focused then within the team to go off and deliver everything.
Yeah, thank you for explaining those models, that model, and those two differences between bridging and bonding capital. And I can see how you apply that during the flow of a project, for example, but also great to hear that actually you can do some network analysis to help you identify in a data-driven way who are those people in your organization who may not be in leadership roles, but who are quite influential and who know what's going on and are great little bridges themselves, connecting different individuals and communities. And Brian Elliott, who you referenced earlier, when he came on the podcast, he was talking about how valuable that kind of group is, because not just because of their connections and networks and the ability to tap into how people are feeling or what people need, but also because they may look very diverse as a group and typically much more diverse than the composition of your leadership team. So they can help compensate for those blind spots in, experience or worldview, etc., where, the leadership team, if they're very much more homogenous, will be missing out on those diverse perspectives. So I thought that was another great, reason to find out who these people are and involve them in your thinking or in your planning as an organization.
Yes. Yeah. And other ways I've seen these organizational network analysis used incredibly well have been around mergers and acquisitions, around promotional opportunities into really key strategic roles. Do we promote the all-star performer, or do we promote the person who's incredibly well networked, because they may not be the same? And it's been very interesting to look and learn and see how different organizations have used that networking analysis to make those really key important decisions.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, really good. And we also talked about at the beginning in your kind of 4 trends that were going on, managers today and how overwhelmed and overloaded they feel. And it is a really difficult time to be a manager because, just workload and work pressure is more intense now than it was 20 years ago. And B, they're so critical to the individual's sense of fulfillment and positive connection with the organization. That relationship's so important. But they've also got, there have to be all things almost to all team members, to be able to identify and support different people's needs, empathize in different ways, etc. So, what do you see as being the really important thing or things that a manager has to be able to do well in an organization today?
And I think you're right with what you've described, Helen. It's a tough role right now, and I'm not surprised to see data that says they're overwhelmed, they feel underprepared, and actually they are underprepared. There's so many of them that haven't had any kind of formal development or even informal development to prepare for, mobilizing teams from afar. That's kind of, how do we get people focused in the right way? How do I set outcomes and expectations which are less about activity and visibility and presenteeism and more about performance and delivery against expectations, priorities, and outcomes. And I think that's a big shift. That is a really, really big shift. So there's something there about how do they do that? How do they do that coordination role? And I know we'll probably talk about meetings as one of the big things that, that managers have to do well. So where does that sit in the rest of the flow of work, and how that needs to be done in terms of updating people, in terms of what are the signals of progress that help me as a manager feel reassured that my team are doing what I need them to do when I can't see them all the time. So there's a very, very different stage, a type of communication, type of transparency, signals of progress. How do I collaborate very differently? How comfortable do I feel as a manager about using all of the technology and the different channels and the different platforms? How do we choose? How do we decide? Let alone my own sense of personal relational skills. So how equipped do I feel to be able to build trust, to be able to trust, to be able to listen really well, to be able to find time and make time to do that really human-centric relationship building, because it's through the quality of the relationships that I have, not only with my own team, but with my peers and those who are looking to me to perform. The quality of those relationships will determine how I perform and how my team performs. So there's a lot nested into that in an environment that nobody's prepared for. So how you used to lead and manage in the past, some of it's still relevant, but some of it's incredibly different.
Yeah, it's really thrown the spotlight on things like you were just talking about, those personal relational skills. For me, that's like becoming more emotionally intelligent as a leader, more self-aware, the kind more of a coach manager rather than a supervisor manager, all of that. And your point around transparency, I think, is so well made in workshops I run with teams to help them think about how they can work smarter, not harder, but also to up the enjoyment factor. Where I see the teams actually really thriving is where that level of transparency about what we are on the hook to deliver, what good looks like, who's doing what's the status of the work, who's overloaded, who's under resourced, and the managers that have nailed a way of tracking that very transparently and sharing it with the teams, that's where the teams actually are thriving, even under a lot of time pressure and a big big agenda to deliver. So
yeah. And I also think there's something about, where do the managers get their peer support from? So where are the community of managers who help each other and support each other in the organisation or cross-organisationally? So their developmental opportunities don't necessarily come from formal structured training. Yes, that's an important part of it in terms of skill development, but also, where is the informal development opportunities within communities of other leaders who face similar challenges, who are sharing the ways that they've approached it? So they're learning together as a community.
Yeah.
And when you can get those created within an organisation, unless they become self-managed, they are incredibly powerful. Whether it's through an action learning methodology, whether it's through circles, there's lots of methodologies that support the ability for a group of like-minded people to come together to share and learn and grow in a supported way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we had hoped to get on to talking about meeting time and AI tech. We have run out of time. So maybe we'll have to park that. Yeah, exactly. We might have to park that for a future conversation. But if people listening want to connect with you professionally, or find out more about OmniWorking and the work you do with organisations, what's the best way for them to do that, Gwen?
The first way, they can connect with me on LinkedIn. So Gwen Stirling-Wilkie on LinkedIn. OmniWorking has a website, which is omni-working.com. And on there, I explain more about the book and the kind of work that we do with organisations. And I have a YouTube channel called, again, Omni-Working, where there's kind of video clips of other interviews and things that I've done. And I upload different conversations that I've had with different people up onto there as well. So that's a resource. And I often run free webinars, which I will kind of let people know about through LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'll include links to all of those places in the show notes, and also some of the sources that you mentioned as well, like Scoop and Flex Index.
It would be wrong of me to say, not to say to people, then I have my book, which contains all of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about in our conversation today.
Yeah, great. Thanks for showing that. So if you're on video, you'll have just got a little glimpse of it, and I'll pop a link to that as well in the show notes so people can look it up and hopefully add it to their reading stack. So yeah, thank you so much, Gwen, for coming to share your very expert, hugely well-informed point of view on what's going on in our world of work today, and some of those really interesting data points that kind of underpin the evidence for that. I think what I'm taking away particularly is your advice to leaders to do connection before content, and to pay attention to how we mobilize teams and manage expectations, and making sure we're really putting effort into that as much as the actual delivery of tasks and the agenda. So thank you so much for coming on the show. You've been a brilliant guest.
Oh, thank you, Helen. It's been great to talk to you.